My name is Lacy Schutz, and I'm the executive director of the Shaker Museum in Columbia County, New York. I'm here in my own home because of the pandemic, remotely communicating with Lesley Dill. Lesley is an artist living in Brooklyn and preparing in isolation for her 2021 exhibition at the Figge Art Museum in Davenport, Iowa, Wilderness.
My particular idea of wilderness in the show, called Wilderness, Light Sizzles Around Me, grows from the perceptions of the early white settlers, people like the Pilgrims, who found the thick forests, the wilderness, to be full of fearful deviltry, a place to be cleared and conquered. But also, it was a place of a profound search for divinity. Then again, think about the Native Americans. For them, the land was not an enemy to control and subdue, but was a home and a friend. In addition, in our country, there is our national stain of slavery as yet another kind of wilderness, one of evil and oppression. And so I gather about 12 historic American personas, 8-foot-tall sculptures made of textiles. I have this cast of characters, which include Anne Hutchinson, John Brown, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Horace Pippin, Sister Gertrude Morgan, and Black Hawk. And I include some of those who fought to end slavery, like Sojourner Truth and Dred Scott. Through them, I'm exploring how. How did they engage in this complex idea of the American wilderness? Being in it, escaping from it, moving forward with it, losing it, writing about it, making art. Even today, we are not outside this idea of wilderness. We are very much still inside it. So, circling back to the Shakers, among my small group of these outliers and activists is Mother Ann Lee, founder of the Shakers.
Yeah, well, Anne Lee was born in Manchester, England in the mid-18th century when it was on the cusp of becoming the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. So there was a lot of turmoil and change going on, both socially and economically. Her father was a blacksmith, and either Anne Lee and or her mother worked in the textile industry in some form. And there came a point when her family expected Anne Lee to marry. She didn't want to, but her father forced her to, and she promptly lost 4 children, either in childbirth or in infancy. And I think that can't help but explain her later insistence on celibacy. I mean, at that point, there was no reliable method for birth control for women except abstinence. And there was really no other way for women to maintain control over their health and avoid dying in childbirth. It's like celibacy was the only way for women to achieve some degree of autonomy before birth control. But there's a lot of misinformation out there about the origins of her spiritual awakening. She was meeting with a group that had splintered off from the Methodists, not Quakers, as is often said. But she had her spiritual awakening. She began preaching and relating her visionary experiences. And I mean, it was incredibly threatening that there was a woman speaking out and preaching. I think in the 18th and 19th centuries, women were completely excluded from commercial and political arenas. And religion was one of the only places they could exercise any kind of volition and make their voices heard. But moreover, she was challenging the dominant structure of a family by saying that people shouldn't have sex and women shouldn't have children. So imagine how threatening that must have been. She was persecuted, she was thrown in jail, she kept preaching, she brought a small group of believers to the United States. And I have to say, I'm just continually inspired by this amazingly strong woman.
You know, I was particularly taken by her as a visionary person that really gave her the inspiration and the strength the drive to found this new community.
Do you think there's an element of otherworldly inspiration in your art? And I want to add to that. In 2019, you were the recipient of the Tell It Slant Award from the Emily Dickinson Museum, and Dickinson has also been an important influence in your work. Do you see any connection between her and Mother Ann?
I do, for sure. An interest in a haunted otherworldliness is embedded in my work. Growing up in New England, I grew up on the history, the historical footprint, as well as the perfume of New England's settler obsessions with divinity and deviltry, on fears of the wilderness out there and the wilderness inside us. Unconsciously, at first, I believe they are what drew me like a magnet to Emily Dickinson as my muse for many years. Her strange and poetic text inspired me and is physically present in hundreds of my sculptures, drawings, and especially my opera, based on her language. In fact, all the 8-foot suspended textile 16 sculptures included in this wilderness exhibit to come in 2021 are about the dichotomy of us all contained within this poetic and historical world. Fear and divinity, devotion and explosive breaks even today as I speak from my Brooklyn studio. We are experiencing explosive breaks during this coronavirus time and a reaffirmation of Black Lives Matters. So Dickinson wrote such things as, "How ruthless are the gentle. Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. Much sense, the starkest madness." I think this is especially for the Shakers. For each ecstatic instant, we must in anguish pay in keen and quivering ratio to the ecstasy. For me, all of these American people, are familiars with the unknown luminosity and terrors of complicated, contradictory life. A wilderness of challenging missions into the unknown, be it the early forests and plains, or the looking for salvation from belief in the words of the Bible and of nature itself. What was the roadmap for these baffled men and women? How did they come to set themselves apart from the pull of this new country, finding their own rules and traditions? Almost all of them, the Shakers, all the early people, their lives, their thinking, their actions have a relationship to visionary revelation. They each had a moment where the universe as God or nature or justice was revealed to them. In many ways, this is the private magnet of my search. I, too, am looking for the light. Let me ask you something. One of the visionary things I've taken from the Shakers is their idea of gift drawings, their visual manifestations from the spirit world. Could you talk about that?
Sure. The Shakers experienced what was called an era of manifestations, and also sometimes called the era of mother's work, around the 1830s through about the 1850s, in which individual Shakers, mostly women, received these so-called gifts from the spirit world. And these gifts came from Mother Ann and other departed spiritual leaders, political leaders, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington spoke from beyond the grave, for instance. But there were also examples of messages received from American Indians who were still in the region but who had suffered persecution and whose numbers were diminished by the genocide that was enacted upon them. They had relationships with the local tribe. They traded with them, and a lot of the knowledge that the Shakers had of the medicinal properties of local plants came from the Indians. They do seem to have seen them as fellow human beings, as evidenced in these spirit communications. But in general, in terms of the era of manifestations, sometimes these spiritual transmissions would involve the body in the form of a new song or a dance or a laughing fit. But most often and most enduringly, they manifested as drawings and text.
Oh, I love hearing about this. This era of spirit world manifestations as text and drawings, for me, my whole life in art has been about just that. The intersection between language and image and luminosity. So the more I learned, the more I realized Mother Ann Lee had to be one of my figures for this series. As I mentioned, I've made an 8-foot sculpture of her out of bright yellow cloth, the color of some Shaker houses. And onto this fabric, I've painted spirit writing, as well as 2 very large silver and black burning trees, as inspired by the iconic image of the blazing tree. And there's more. I decided to make a sculpture of the idea of heavenly Mother Ann Lee. So I made an 8-foot translucent yellow and white organza figure that will float above the earthly Ann Lee. And then from that figure, we'll suspend 2 small female sculptures. These special artist women received images for drawings right from the sky into their minds. And speaking of women, please tell me a little bit more about another fascinating Shaker, Rebecca Cox Jackson.
She was an extraordinary Black woman who lived in Philadelphia, and she had a religious awakening, divorced her husband, and joined the Shakers at Watervliet, New York. This was around the same time as the era of manifestations. She came to believe that the Shakers at Watervliet weren't doing enough outreach to Black communities, and she returned to Philadelphia, where she lived with her female companion, and she founded her own Black Shaker community, which also consisted mostly of women, interestingly. So she was a really interesting woman.
So interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, so the Shakers had a kind of extraordinary history with Black people in America. The first documented African-American person to join the Shakers at Mount Lebanon was in 1796. The Shakers in Pleasant Hill in Kentucky voted to integrate, basically, I think it was 1816. So that's an extraordinarily early acceptance of people of other races into those communities. And in addition to the gender equality, had this long history of inclusion as well.
That is so extraordinary.
Lesley, can you talk about how we met?
We met in the context of this wonderful project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, fellows from different backgrounds, and all of us talking about the heritage of the Shakers and how it connected to our own spiritual lives. After being immersed in this Shaker group, I felt I really wanted to include Mother Ann Lee in my own artwork.
Can you talk about other women from America's history who have been important in your work?
Began really with a number of singular, strong-voiced women of faith and courage from early American times. Anne Hutchinson, Mary Rowlandson, Sojourner Truth. And in 1637 and 1638, Anne Hutchinson was brought to trial by the Massachusetts Puritan ministers. In the 1630s, women were not supposed to speak publicly except through a husband, a brother, or a male child. So when Anne Hutchinson spoke to small gatherings of men and women in her house and spoke of her own experience of grace and faith as salvation, not through traditional good works or listening to sermons, she was excommunicated and scorned in her trial by John Winthrop's words. Here they are, some of them. This American Jezebel, seeing the fluentness of her tongue and her willingness to open herself and to divulge opinions and to sow her seed in us. Let us please note, and I will repeat, the odd sexual nature of his language and also the odd sense of biology that she could sow her seed in us. I account her a very dangerous woman. John Winthrop. I am so glad things have changed so much.
Yeah, they've changed so much.
I know, 400 years it's been. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because 100 years later, men continued to be so threatened by women that they thought were powerful. Anne Lee went on a long proselytizing trip across New England, and at some point, an angry mob literally stripped her clothing off of her because they could not believe that a woman would have the audacity to preach, and they thought she must surely be a man.
Oh my God, they stripped the clothes off this simple, pure faith woman. That is unbelievable. You know, Sojourner Truth was a fantastic orator and was a very strong voice just before and during the American Civil War. And so one day she was speaking and, for feminism, for racial equality, and with her straightforward fervency, the men said to her, you aren't a woman. You must be a man. I'm sure that you are a man. And she said, no. And she raised her blouse up and said, aren't I a woman? And showed her breasts.
That's incredible.
It is. And by the way, if I may continue, she is often misquoted as saying, ain't I a woman? But please note, Sojourner Truth was raised as a northern slave. So her English was northern. It was not some quaint southern elocution. It was crisp northern speaking.
Well, I mean, that's all quite mortifying.
It is.
But it also reminds me of the idea of mortification that comes across in a lot of your work, and especially for this exhibition. It's, the Shakers are often thought of today as some sort of quaint American oddity of the 19th century, and they're known mostly for chairs and for having been celibate. But in their very early, late 18th century days in the wilderness, they engaged in ecstatic dance and acts of mortification, like licking the floor. What attracts you to the notion of mortification?
Well, the great Jonathan Edwards, who was active when Mother Ann Lee lived, though he preceded her theologically. He died in 1758. He is known for his sermon, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, which galvanized a century of spiritual anarchy in the United States. He made salvation the main goal. He himself spoke about his experiences of softness, of quiet rapture, and inward sweet delight. I had a secret place of my own in the woods, he wrote, and thus he encouraged a personal experience with God in his church, which goes right back to Anne Hutchinson. who had been persecuted for just that, personal inward grace. What Jonathan Edwards opened drove men and women to be swallowed up in God, often in New York and New England spiritual campgrounds of frenzied bodily movements. An experience of doubt, shame, and difficulty often led to a search for a valid redemption, and so a crisis was actually prized by the early Puritans and Calvinists. Jonathan Edwards used the nature of affliction as an opportunity to re-examine himself. And this is true with Mary Rowlandson, who, in her captivity narrative, going back to 1675, wrote, "Affliction I wanted, and affliction I had. I have learned to look beyond smaller troubles." Her Puritan faith that living through affliction was a mark of God's grace sustained her. So, when we come to the Shakers and their testimony, for example, by Thomas Brown in 1812, he was talking about the Shakers who were speaking to him. "They have told me they had some gifts of mortification, to bark like a dog, to crow like a cock, to make noises like a squirrel, to rejoice by laughing." And I imagine that all this happened during their times of ecstatic dancing. And in 1837, Russell Haskell wrote, "Kneeling with their faces to the floor, licking the dust therefrom." So I am attracted by this unusual idea of mortification, which sounds like it is perhaps a kind of an unwelcome form of measles. But it was thought of actually being a way of homage, of putting yourself to the side, of putting yourself underneath what it is, what you believed in. Such writers as Emily Dickinson wrote, "Renunciation is a piercing virtue, a putting out of eyes." So, to close, I was wondering if you might read one of your favorite Dickinson poems.
I would love to do that. And as you know, one of my quarantine projects has been working my way through the complete poems of Emily Dickinson.
Fantastic.
I just finished it last night in 1,770 some poems. But I think this one is one of my favorites, and it really speaks to the moment that we're in. Hope is a strange invention, a patent of the heart, in unremitting action, yet never wearing out. Of this electric adjunct, not anything is known, but its unique momentum embellish all we own.
And what was that? Its unique
momentum. Its unique momentum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It has been such a pleasure talking to you.
Same.